Now let's transition to talking about gestation and pregnancy and family planning. So to start off, let's talk about mammals for a minute. Mammals are groups of organisms that have fur or hair, they have lactation, typically some form of internal gestation, and a placenta, possibly. Um, and mammals are often case-selected, meaning that they have fewer offspring and devote more parental care and more resources to developing their offspring and taking care of their offspring. And their young also develop at a slower rate. They tend to be a little bit more intelligent than other organisms. And there are three types of mammals. There are monotremes, marsupials, and placentals. The monotremes are the egg-laying mammals, like the platypus and the echidna. So they are not using an internal form of gestation like we see in many mammals, but they still lactate and have some other mammal properties. Marsupials have a partially internal gestation, so they give birth to very young, undeveloped offspring, and then the newborns will transition into a pouch where they will continue to develop and nurse for several weeks. Placental mammals include many of the mammals that we think of, zebras, primates, things like that. They have internal gestation. Their offspring develop further along by the time they are birthed, and they have a system of nutrient and waste exchange using a placenta. So humans and primates are placental mammals. We have completely internal gestation. Humans are a bit different in that our offspring take an even longer time to develop and mature than some other mammals do. So we give birth to offspring that are relatively undeveloped, not to the same extent as what we see with marsupials, but just because the development process takes a very long time in humans. They are relatively weak and undeveloped, and their growth occurs over a longer period of time. So that requires a significant amount of parental investment. If any of you have kids, you know that firsthand. So let's go and talk about fertilization, what actually happens. So in humans, once copulation is happening and ejaculation takes place, the sperm will begin swimming toward the cervix, through the uterus, and into the fallopian tubes, or the oviducts. And in a typical ejaculate, there are about 100 million sperm. So this is a very perilous journey for the sperm. Many never make it through the cervix. Some are attacked by immune cells in the uterus, and roughly half of those that remain enter the empty oviduct. So remember, in general, only one egg is released from one ovary per menstrual cycle, and it rotates based on which ovary actually releases the egg. So out of the 100 million plus contenders, only several dozen sperm actually reach the egg. When sperm and the egg meet in the oviduct, the head of the sperm secretes an enzyme that helps the sperm swim through the jelly-like coating of the egg. Once through this layer, the sperm fuses with the cell membrane of the egg, and the membrane will then undergo chemical changes blocking other sperm. Only the genetic material from the sperm will enter the egg, so the mitochondria and other parts of the sperm remain outside of the egg. Remember that humans inherit organelles like the mitochondria from the mother, and these organelles are in the egg. At this point, the egg undergoes meiosis, which is the cellular division process that gametes go through. The genetic material from the sperm will then fuse with the genetic material from the egg, and a fertilized egg or a zygote is formed. Once the genetic material from a sperm fuses with the genetic material from an egg and the zygote is formed, the zygote will then begin to divide from 1 cell to 2, from 2 cells to 4, etc. During this time, the embryo begins to move down the fallopian tube toward the uterus, and around 2 to 3 days post-fertilization, the developing embryo is basically this ball of cells. Around day 4 to 5 after fertilization, the egg becomes a blastula, which is a hollow ball of cells. And at this stage, it enters the uterus and will hatch out of a tough outer covering. So once hatched, which is about 1 to 2 weeks post-fertilization, the embryo will interact with the uterine lining and may implant or embed itself in the uterine lining. Only about 50% of embryos successfully implant in the uterine lining. The rest are carried out of the body with the next onset of menstruation. So there are some different terms that I've used throughout that I do want you guys to be able to distinguish. So know the difference between a zygote, embryo, blastula, and a fetus. Embryonic development is focusing on the formation of important systems in the body, and fetal development is focusing on growth and development so that the offspring can survive in the outside world. So a zygote is a fertilized egg, and an embryo refers to up to the 10th week of pregnancy. A blastula refers to the embryo and the placenta, and a fetus refers to week 11 and on. So some other terms that I'm going to mention you don't need to remember, like gastrula and neurulation, but at this point we have the formation of a gastrula occurring, and this occurs around 3 weeks post-fertilization or around week 5 of pregnancy. At this stage, the embryonic cells are characterized by 3 distinct layers: the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm. And they will give rise to specific tissue types that you can see pictured here. Neurulation is the formulation of the neurula, which occurs around week 4 post-fertilization or week 6 of pregnancy. At this stage, the neural tube, which becomes the spinal cord and brain, closes, and the tissues that will eventually comprise the brain begin to fold inward. The embryo at this stage is about 3 millimeters in length, or about half the length of a grain of rice. After neurulation, the limb buds begin to form and the embryo elongates. At 7 weeks post-fertilization, or week 9 of pregnancy, the embryo is about 15 millimeters in length and has limbs and digital rays that will eventually become fingers and toes. At around the 12th week after fertilization, week 14 of pregnancy, the embryo becomes classified as a fetus and the pregnancy enters the 2nd trimester. The fetus is about 10 centimeters long at this point. Somewhere around the 24th week of pregnancy, the fetus, if delivered early, may be viable with medical intervention. Current survival rates for babies born at 24 weeks and that receive extensive medical care are around 50%. The 3rd trimester begins around the 27th week. Pregnancy continues until roughly 40 weeks after the date of the last menstruation.